When it comes to most anything that has to do with entertainment, I usually don't take the initiative to look into something that someone else genuinely enjoys. Not because I'm trying to disrespect that person for liking what they do, but because I've already spent my irritably short attention span on a few other things and am completely enamored by them. The way I see it, most of my friends are like, hey, I just got HBO on my television and I've been wanting to give Game of Thrones a try, and they'll get around to watching it over the next few months. For me, it's more like, oh, right, I never finished watching Rise of the Shield Hero after I moved to Hong Kong for a few months. Now I'll get back to watching after I finish playing this game, which, spoiler alert, very rarely ever happens. The only time that I ever watch TV shows or even some movies nowadays is if I'm visiting my family and they happen to be watching a series that evening. I mean, heck, you can ask Snappy. It took him several attempts to convince me to watch ReZero for the first time, and now it's one of my favorite anime series out of the 5 that I've watched to completion so far. Enter Sunless Skies, a game that one friend of mine told me about and showed me some gameplay which I was wholly interested in, well, because look at it. It is, at its most shallow, a very boring game to play, and serves little function outside of being an interactive wallpaper, and it wasn't until another friend of mine shoved a copy into my face and said that I should give the game a proper go that I actually tried it. And so I did, and I absolutely loved it. The same friend of mine later went on to back Phil Better's next big project, Sunless Skies, on Kickstarter, and he was given 2 copies of the game as a token of gratitude for his delicious contribution.
I think we all know where this is going.
Phil Better's brand has always been centered around non-linear storytelling that gives the player absolutely nothing at first. Most other games will roll the exposition out in front of the player like a red carpet and make the player character the pivotal piece that's required for completing their story. Sunless Skies does have a red carpet, except the red carpet speaks in riddles and will only give you a straight answer if you bring it a vanilla root harvested from the far-off mountains of Afghanistan. However, what isn't nearly praised enough is their ability to create a foreboding and captivating atmosphere with the help of the phenomenal soundtrack, composed by Meredith Solomon and Brent Barkman. If you watch movies like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, or more specifically if you listen to them, you'll notice that they usually have a soundtrack perpetually playing in the background. Whenever the soundtrack stops or changes tempo, it's usually at very specific times in the movie, where the audience is meant to feel a sense of uneasiness or immense triumph. Changes in the soundtrack are meant to be events, and Sunless Skies takes that effect of stopping in silence and flips it on its head. When traveling between ports, most of the game is totally silent aside from your locomotive and creatures that scream at you from a distance, which makes any change in the sounds of the game that much more significant. Now, fun little factoid about Chaboy, I have a mild phobia of thunder, so I get terrible anxiety whenever I'm passing through the Midnight Belt in Eleuteria. Normally my brain can tell the difference between thunder and someone trying to make thunder sounds, but here in Sunless Skies my brain becomes the big dum-dum and spikes my adrenaline up to 11. In other words, kudos to Feel Better Games for tricking me psychologically with their fantastic sound design. The soundtracks are mostly used to signify when you've entered a new area, and while they nearly jump scare you at first, they almost become reassuring. I say almost because not every song of the soundtrack is what you'd hear out of an adventure soundtrack like from Pyre, but out of horror games, which I think helps add to the horror tag that sits on the game's Steam page. Although the game is labeled as a horror game, I don't see Sunless Skies as a strong standout in the genre. Sure, it has horror elements, but at the same time it has elements of being a visual novel, gothic, steampunk, adventure exploration, top-down RPG, puzzle, horror game at times, but it's not any one of these first. So Terraria is a 2D sandbox game first, and then an action platformer and everything else. Darkest Dungeon is a turn-based RPG first, and then gothic horror and everything else. According to Veilbetter's website, Sunless Skies is a gothic horror game. Sort of. But it's also a combination of everything else all at once. And if anything, Sunless Skies is a highly interactive story first, which would be a fine genre to be if visual novels weren't already a thing, and since Sunless Skies is so far removed from being your typical visual novel. It's this lack of identity that I feel drives a lot of people away, because the people who, for instance, expect a horror game will find themselves disappointed. And at the same time, it's Feel Better's bizarre dedication to world building and using other thematic elements to guide along to keep the more dedicated players interested. You don't play Sunless Skies to play a horror game. You play Sunless Skies to explore a dangerous, terrifying, and maddening world which can give you the spooks that's being taken over poorly by an early 20th century Britain while a sentient bee talks to you about the delicate process of refining the state of human souls. All the while you're driving a choo-choo train that shoots missiles at possessed book demons, so what's not to love? Perhaps the fact that you can do the choo-choo. Fail Better, please give me the choo-choo button, I need this in my life. Jokes aside, there's still a lot about this game that's hard to love, and a lot of it has to do with the game's sense of progression. When you first start up the game, you're given a choice between 3 very clear and linear paths. 1, by getting enough gold to retire. 2, writing a generation-defining song, or 3, uncovering the truth of the stars, though the game suggests that you complete one of the other 2 first, as the benefits from completing either one of those will carry over into your next captain's story. And initially, the game is a little tough on you in the same way as Sunless Sea was, but the low cost of fuel along with the low amount required to fuel your locomotive in comparison to how easy it is to make bank in this game makes a lot of things feel less like calculated achievements and more like being handed a series of free samples from Costco. Hi, would you like to sample our free fuel and hull repair options today, sir? The problem that I had with this game's predecessor, Sunless Sea, was that making cash was way too difficult in comparison to the ludicrous price of much-needed upgrades. And the best way that I found to make cash was by taking illicit deals and turning them into a contact in London. The repercussions of getting caught were always something that hung in the balance, and it was kind of nerve-wracking in a way. In retrospect, that was probably the charm of it all, the sense of dread surrounding your every move. And here in Sunless Skies, you can fulfill totally legal, free, and untouched courier requests by purchasing whatever is of an item, driving out to the port that wants it, then selling it back for double the asking price. This also doesn't include the fact that if you find that item on sale for 2/3 of the price, you can still sell it to the commissions for double the normal price. Some things like ministry-approved literature don't sell for much, but when you sell more expensive stuff like bronzewood, whew, easiest 1,000 sovereigns of my life. And it's not like bronzewood is incredibly difficult to find either. There's a specific station in the Reach that sells bronzewood, so if you ever get a commission to deliver bronzewood, you know that you can rely on that place to always have it in stock. Now that I'm able to, as the cool kids say, make it rain with money, one would think that the issue of not having the cash in Sunless Sea to make one upgrade would be gone entirely, but Failbetter ends up taking away any sense of accomplishment from the player by making most of the locomotive upgrades worthless. Alright, maybe worthless is a bit hyperbolic, but what bothers me the second most is that there's no way to upgrade the speed of your locomotive. In Sunless Sea, you could upgrade the power of your engines to make you zoom faster at the cost of more fuel, but you can't do that in Sunless Skies. The main difference between each locomotive is that they have different sizes of crew quarters, can hold different numbers of attachments, and each one handles slightly differently. Aside from that, you make it from Port Prosper to High Risk in the same time with a Bedivere of the Pelennor. There are other upgrades included in the shop with the locomotive, but most of them are combat related, and since the game's combat is about as streamlined as a cardboard box filled with shards of glass, there's really no point in buying some of the upgrades. Crew quarters, whack. Better mining attachments, whack. The guns that I currently have on my main campaign, double whack. Even if you can buy the upgrades, you can't be guaranteed that your stats are high enough to equip them properly. I found this out by accident one time when I bought a pretty high level cannon and promptly found out that I needed 50 or more veils to even equip it, though I wasn't barred from buying it and sold it back for half the price. Granted, that bit was kind of my fault for getting excited about a new set of artillery for my locomotive, but looking at the game now, I don't think my experience would have been much different because of how Sunless Skies is an interactive story first, and all of its genre-related elements second, and combat is a close third. Movement in this game is interesting, to say the least. You are suspended in the sky by locomotive magic, and the movement in this game really reflects that. Simply letting go of the W button won't stop you from moving forwards for a little bit, and any sideways movement isn't halted at an exact point either. Even using the dodge button sends you flying much further than you'd expect to one side. It makes sense for the setting of the game, but there have been countless times where I forget to compensate for this and have crashed into various pieces of the landscape. Crashing into things wouldn't be so bad because most of that also comes from the moments where I'm coasting along and not watching where I'm going, so it's actually mostly my fault in that respect. Sunless Skies has some form of progression in the shape of a leveling system that gives you experience every time you do something in the game, whether that be defeat an enemy locomotive, talk with NPCs, or discover a new port. And just like most other RPGs, once you've accumulated enough experience points, you'll level up and be able to choose an aspect of your past, where you go to develop your captain's story, and pick what stats you want to increase based on the important point of their past. The stats are veils for sneaky people, mirrors for the observant types, hearts for those of you who want to win the game, and iron for dumb fucking idiots like me who thought that iron worked the same way it did in Sunless Sea. Each aspect you choose gives you 5 of the first stat you pick and 3 of the second one that's attached at the end. These stats then go on to impact your success rate in the more dicey story-based encounters that you have in the game, and some stats will do better by choosing alternate options. You know, I just realized that this game and Darkest Dungeon both deal with RNG, and I like both games. I swear I don't have a gambling addiction. When you're not trying to uncover the incredibly deep lore of this game or traveling between stations, you have the option to speak with your officers. Officers are specialized crew that can be hired at specific stations for a certain fee. Each officer grants you certain stats, and each one has a story that you can follow by traveling to different parts of their world. Their stats aside, I don't find the stories of the officers to be particularly interesting when compared to what I can learn from interacting with the NPCs at certain stations. A couple of them are involved with the lore, but the ones that are usually require that you give them something incredibly rare and or expensive in return. My point is that the lore of the game is better found through exploring the different stations across the skies, as the characters there are usually more grounded and involved in their location. The officers simply lead you to these locations, and very few do little to tell you more than what you can find out by simply visiting the port. Which is fine by me. I love solving the heavily involved mysteries that each port contains, and I'm quite happy with having more mystery be the reward for uncovering the mysteries that are involved within. Part of me thinks that the change from officers telling the story to your experiences in port telling a greater story from sea to skies was an intentional change, as it means that your officers are just as clueless as you are, while the residents of each location know everything but aren't inclined to tell you anything. I mean, hey, I definitely wouldn't give away my darkest secrets to the first grease-covered captain that demanded them from me. At least, not without payment first. Now that I talk about it more, it does make the officers a little more endearing because they're after the same thing the player is. Closure, though their variation of closure is slightly different from what the player is after. I think it just missed the fact that the characters that were aboard my boat in Sunless Sea were connected to larger parts of the lore, and that they had more to do with the lore than the officers in Skies do. It's kind of like meeting something who was involved in making a movie. Their experience was unique, and it would take some time to hear everything that they would have to say about working with famous actors and what they did to keep the movie running as smoothly as it did. Just imagine meeting one of the digital artists who have worked so hard on the Marvel movies and hearing what they had to say about the movie. Man, that'd be so cool. Alright, I'm getting off track. In Sunless Sea, there was one officer called the Tireless Mechanic. In order to complete his storyline, you had to go into this mystical frozen fortress known as Frostfound. The locals who had taken up residence on the port near Frostfound had no idea what was actually inside the fortress, aside from knowing that it drove you perfectly mad. The process leading up to that point was a very bizarre series of events that allowed us to, alongside the Tireless Mechanic, take a peek of what really goes on behind the metaphorical magician's curtain. I keep flip-flopping between saying, yeah, Sunless Skies' story is good, but it's bad, but it's good too. A lot of that comes from how the best of the story is enriching and fun and engaging, while the worst of it has about as much personality as Kristen Stewart in the Twilight movies. Good bits of story. The Queen using a nuke to destroy the old sun so that she could create her own and establish her dominance over the region. Bad bits of story. Your first officer wants to find his dead friend. Good bits of story. The mysterious disappearance of the people in Hybris. Bad bits of story. Your aunt is a secret agent. Alright, your aunt being a secret agent could potentially be something interesting, but in a game that's haunted by and so centrally focused around antediluvian, demonic, Lovecraftian forces, it ends up taking away from the game rather than adding to it. Another thing that I've seen people discredit this game for is that in previous games you were hardly ever given an inkling of an idea of what exactly everything was. The Masters, the true identity of the devils, and the nature of the gods in the skies. Whenever you do get around to the end of the story in this game, most of everything is readily explained to you, which I can see as a slap in the face to the people who have been piecing together scraps of information and theory crafting ever since Failbetter's first game, Fall in London, that came out years ago. Now it's just... there you go. Next story, please. I made this video mostly because I found consolidating my thoughts on this game properly to be rather difficult, as my opinion of the game varied depending on how I was feeling that day. It's also partly because I know that this game is attracted to a very specific audience, and by specific audience I mean the kinds of people who enjoy reading lore-heavy pieces like the Silmarillion. I'd recommend this game to people who like to solve mysteries and can appreciate the time and effort that went into the writing and visual and auditory effects of this game. Gameplay doesn't really exist here, so if you're looking for something that's actually involved gameplay wise, then there's no point in spending $28 on what I think you might see as a little more than interactive wallpaper. I mean, damn if this game ain't pretty though. Thanks for watching. I'll have a link to my first impressions of the game in the description below, as well as some other social media links. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great day, night, or sabbatical depending on when and where you watch this video, and I'll see you on the flip side. Goodbye.